He scripted the greatest wrestling match in history, move by move, in a cheap spiral notebook. He generated millions of dollars with a single raspy catchphrase, and he locked the most beautiful woman in the world inside a locker room because he was terrified she would leave him. Macho Man. Randy Savage was a neon-clad god who survived steel chairs, 40-foot falls, and the drug-fueled excess of the 1980s. But while he looked invincible on the outside, his heart was quietly turning to stone on the inside. How did a man who spent 30 years being the loudest voice in the room end up dying in absolute silence? Randy Savage did not invent his intensity, he inherited it. He was born on November 15, 1952 in Columbus, Ohio, the first son of Angelo Poffo. Angelo was not merely a father, he was the defining gravitational force of Randy's entire existence. An Italian-American Navy veteran and professional wrestler, Angelo was a man of extreme discipline and eccentric frugality. He was a shooter, a wrestler capable of legitimately hurting opponents, who held the world record for sit-ups just to prove the dominance of the human will. Randy grew up in a household that operated like a boot camp. Along with his younger brother Lanny, born 2 years later, Randy was raised on the road. The Poffo family lived the nomadic life of the wrestling territories, moving from state to state as Angelo chased paydays. This instability forged Randy into an insular, observant child. He learned early on that the only people he could trust were his blood relatives. While Lanny responded to this environment by becoming the family diplomat and intellectual, Randy responded by becoming a soldier. He absorbed Angelo's lesson that the world was a hostile place, and that the only defense was being better, stronger, and harder than everyone else. Despite being born into the wrestling business, Randy Poffo held the industry in contempt. He hated the smell of the locker rooms, the cigar smoke, and the predetermined outcomes. He wanted something real. He wanted a meritocracy. He found it in baseball. By the time the family settled in Downers Grove, Illinois, Randy's singular obsession was the major leagues. He didn't just play baseball, he attacked it. He idolized Johnny Bench, the catcher for the Cincinnati Reds, and molded himself in that image. The position of catcher suited Randy's psychology perfectly. It was the most punishing role on the field, requiring a masochistic tolerance for pain and a general's command of the game. At Downers Grove North High School, Randy was a phenomenon. He wasn't the biggest player, but he was the most intense. He trained with a manic energy that unnerved his teammates. He would spend hours throwing a ball against a brick wall to improve his transfer speed, doing it until his fingers bled, then taping them up and throwing again. He was named an all-state player, a distinction that validated his belief that he was destined for the show. In 1971, that destiny seemed to arrive. The St. Louis Cardinals, one of the most prestigious organizations in baseball, held an open tryout in St. Louis. 300 hopefuls showed up, dreaming of a contract. Only one left with a job. Randy Poffo was signed as a catcher at the age of 18. He bypassed college, bypassed safety, and stepped onto the bus for the minor leagues. The reality of minor league baseball in the early 1970s was a brutal test of character. It was a world of long bus rides through the humid American South, terrible food, and poverty wages. Randy was assigned to the Sarasota Cardinals in the Gulf Coast League. In that debut 1971 season, Randy Poffo was promising. He played in 35 games and batted .286, a very respectable average for a teenage catcher in professional ball. He was known as a contact hitter, a guy who could put the ball in play and who played defense with a reckless abandon. He blocked the plate like a linebacker. If a runner was coming home, Randy didn't shy away. He welcomed the collision. However, the psychological cracks began to show early. Randy was a perfectionist. When he struck out, he didn't just walk back to the dugout. He seethed. He would retreat into a shell of silence, replaying the mistake over and over in his mind. He was, in the words of his brother Lanny, too tight. He wanted it too much. While other players relaxed with beers after the game, Randy was doing push-ups or staring at his bat, willing himself to be better. He moved to the Cincinnati Reds organization in 1972, a dream come true as it was the home of his idol, Johnny Bench. But this was a double-edged sword. To make the big leagues with the Reds, he would have to displace the greatest catcher of all time. The pressure Randy placed on himself was crushing. He played for the Tampa Tarpons in the Florida State League, grinding out at bats, fighting for every inch. The turning point of Randy Savage's life, the moment that killed the baseball player and birthed the wrestler, happened in 1973. It was a single play that altered history. During a game, a runner rounded third base and charged toward home plate. Randy Poffo did what he always did. He planted his feet, dropped his center of gravity, and prepared for impact. The collision was violent. The runner crashed into Randy's right side, his throwing arm. The pain was immediate and blinding. Randy had separated his right shoulder. For any athlete, this is a major injury. For a catcher, whose entire value relies on the ability to snap throw a baseball to second base in under 2 seconds, it is a career death sentence. The diagnosis was grim. The rotator cuff and the AC joint were severely damaged. The doctors told him he needed surgery and significant time off. They told him his throwing power would likely never return to elite levels. But Randy Poffo did not accept the diagnosis. In a display of the obsessive, borderline delusional determination that would later define the Macho Man, Randy decided he would simply evolve. If his right arm was broken, he would become a left-handed catcher. It sounds insane because it is. At the professional level, you cannot simply switch dominance. The neural pathways required to throw a 90-mile-per-hour fastball with precision take a lifetime to build. Randy didn't care. He spent the entire offseason in his backyard with Angelo and Lanny. He tied his right arm to his side to prevent himself from using it. He picked up a ball with his left hand and threw it against the wall for hours, for days, for weeks. He taught himself to throw left-handed. He taught himself to catch with his right hand. He actually reported to spring training the following year, attempting to play as a lefty. The experiment, brave as it was a failure. The mechanics weren't there. The pop time was too slow. Runners stole bases on him at will. Furthermore, the shoulder injury had ruined his swing. He couldn't generate the torque needed to drive the ball. In 1974, playing for the Tampa Tarpons, the numbers told the story. He appeared in 131 games, but his batting average flatlined at .232. He managed 9 home runs and 66 RBIs, but he led the league in strikeouts. He was swinging angry. He was swinging desperate. One afternoon in 1974, the manager called him into the office. The Cincinnati Reds were releasing him. Randy walked out of that office into the blinding Florida sun, and his world collapsed. He was 21 years old. He had no college education. He had no trade skills. He had spent his entire youth singularly focused on one goal, and he had failed. The shame was unbearable. He felt he had humiliated his father. He felt he was nothing. For months, Randy Poffo was a ghost. He drifted. But Angelo Poffo was not a man who allowed idleness. Angelo had recently started his own outlaw wrestling promotion, International Championship Wrestling, based in Lexington, Kentucky. He needed bodies. He needed talent. "Randy," Angelo said, "get in the ring." Randy resisted. He viewed wrestling as a carnival sideshow, a fake pantomime for the gullible. It was beneath a professional athlete. But hunger is a powerful motivator. With no baseball checks coming in, Randy reluctantly agreed to train. He didn't want anyone to know. He was ashamed. If his old baseball teammates saw him in tights, he wouldn't be able to bear it. So when he first stepped into the ring in late 1973, he covered his face. He wore a yellow mask. He called himself the Spider. The mask was a shield. It allowed Randy Poffo to disappear. And inside that ring, something unexpected happened. The frustration, the rage, the heartbreak of the failed baseball career, it all found an outlet. When he hit the ropes, he hit them with violence. When he slammed an opponent, he was exorcising the demons of the Tampa Tarpons. He was a natural. He had the explosive twitch muscles of a catcher and the cardio of a marathon runner. He didn't wrestle like the slow, methodical grapplers of the 1970s. He moved like a pinball. By 1974, with baseball officially over, the mask had to come off. You can't make real money as a generic masked jobber, but he couldn't just be Randy Poffo. That name sounded like a tax accountant. He traveled to Georgia to work a few dates for Ole Anderson, a legendary promoter and tough guy. Anderson watched this kid wrestle. He saw Randy throwing his body around with zero regard for his own safety, crashing into turnbuckles, diving off the top rope, a style that was virtually unseen at the time. Anderson pulled him aside. "Kid," he grumbled, "you wrestle like a damn savage." Randy stopped. The word resonated. Savage. It was primal. It was dangerous. It was the antithesis of the disciplined, clean-cut baseball player he had tried to be. "Randy Savage," he said. He needed a nickname. The wrestling world was full of royalty, kings, princes, dukes. He wanted something that projected pure, unadulterated masculinity, something that compensated for the failure he felt inside. Macho Man. It was a shield. The Macho Man wasn't just a character, it was a suit of armor. Randy Poffo was a shy, sensitive, heartbroken ex-baseball player. Randy Savage was a god. The early years of Randy Savage's wrestling career were not spent in sold-out arenas. They were spent in the trenches of his father's ICW promotion. ICW was an outlaw promotion, meaning it wasn't part of the National Wrestling Alliance cartel. This made the Poffos pariahs. Established wrestlers wouldn't work with them. They were blackballed. This isolation forced Randy, Lanny, and Angelo to be a self-contained unit. They drove the ring truck. They set up the chairs. They sold the popcorn. And then they went out and wrestled for 45 minutes. It was in these sweaty gymnasiums in Kentucky and Tennessee that Savage developed his craft. Because the roster was thin, he had to learn to wrestle everyone, big guys, small guys, brawlers, technicians. He learned how to control a crowd. He learned that if he screamed loud enough, if he acted crazy enough, people would stop looking at the empty seats and look at him. He began to develop the voice. The Macho Man voice, that deep, raspy growl, was not natural. It was a fabrication, partially inspired by his desire to sound tougher than he was. He injured his vocal cords, forcing that sound, gargling the gravel until it became permanent. The catchphrase, "Ooh, yeah?" had innocent origins. It was something Lanny used to say as a child when he was excited. Randy took it, slowed it down, deepened it, and turned it into a sexual, menacing purr. But the most critical development in these early years wasn't the character, it was the chip on his shoulder. Because the NWA blackballed the Poffos, Randy felt the wrestling world was against him. He felt superior to the stars in the big territories who were protected by politics. He believed he was the best worker in the world, and he was determined to prove it by force. This anger led him to Memphis. In the late 1970s, the Memphis territory run by Jerry Jarrett and Jerry the King Lawler was the Wild West of professional wrestling. It was a place where storylines were loose, violence was high, and the lines between fiction and reality were constantly blurred. Angelo Poffo eventually invaded the Memphis territory in a storyline that mirrored real life. The Poffos were the outsiders coming to take Lawler's crown. This set the stage for the first truly legendary feud of Randy Savage's career. Jerry Lawler was the king of Memphis. He was a god in Tennessee. To make money, Savage had to become the devil. Savage threw himself into the role of the heel villain with terrifying commitment. He realized that to be hated, he couldn't just be a bad guy. He had to be erratic. He started wearing more flamboyant outfits, sequins, feathers, colors that clashed violently. He wanted to be an eyesore. The matches between Savage and Lawler are now considered classics of the brawling style. They weren't technical masterpieces of leverage and holds. They were fights. They fought in the ring. They fought in the parking lot. They fought in the concession stands. In December 1978, Savage defeated Lawler for the AWA Southern Heavyweight Championship. It was his first taste of major gold. But the feud was more than titles. It was about respect. Lawler, a veteran, tested Savage. He hit him hard. Savage, the failed baseball player with the broken shoulder, hit back harder. During this time, Savage's body began to pay the toll. The high-risk style he adopted, specifically the top rope elbow drop, was punishing. Every night, Savage climbed to the top turnbuckle, launched himself into the air, and landed with his full body weight on his hip and side. He did this on concrete hard rings. He did it in unheated armories. He did it when he had the flu. He never missed a spot. He was trying to outwork his failure. By the early 1980s, Randy Savage was arguably the best performer in North America, not signed to the World Wrestling Federation. He was a complete package. He could talk people into the building and he could keep them on the edge of their seats. But he was lonely. The road was a solitary place, especially for a man who trusted no one outside his family. He needed an anchor. He needed someone who could understand the madness without being consumed by it. In 1984, in a gym in Kentucky, he met a 24-year-old woman named Elizabeth Hewlett. She was working as an announcer for his father's TV show. She was small, soft-spoken, and utterly beautiful. She was everything Randy was not. He fell hard. It was a possessive, overwhelming love. He saw in her a purity that he felt he had lost. They married later that year. When the call finally came from the big leagues, from Vince McMahon and the expanding WWF in 1985, Randy Savage was ready. He was 32 years old. He had 12 years of scars, a broken baseball dream, and a character honed in the fires of the outlaw territories. He packed his bags, he packed his robes, and he packed his wife. The Macho Man was coming to New York, and he was bringing the madness with him. Randy Savage arrived in the World Wrestling Federation in June 1985, instantly disrupting a landscape dominated by lumbering giants like Hulk Hogan and Andre the Giant. While the WWF was built on muscle mass and cartoon simplicity, Savage brought a frantic, terrifying intensity. He didn't just defeat opponents, he dismantled them with a speed that made the rest of the roster look like they were moving underwater. His introduction was a masterclass in marketing. After weeks of vignettes building his aura as the unpredictable, the top managers in the company, Bobby Heenan, Jimmy Hart, Freddie Blassie, clamored for his services on television. Savage rejected the establishment in one stroke, introducing his manager, the unknown, soft-spoken Elizabeth Hewlett. The visual contrast was brilliant. Savage was a sweating, screaming maniac in neon fringe. Elizabeth was an elegant, terrified lady. This Beauty and the Beast dynamic hooked millions, but it also shattered the barrier between Savage's work and his life. By bringing his real wife into the violent world of wrestling, he made his personal vulnerability public property. Savage's rise was meteoric. He was undeniably the best in-ring performer on the card, introducing high-risk moves like the top rope double axe handle while wrestling with the psychology of a paranoid animal. He constantly checked his back and attacked with sudden, vicious bursts. This intensity led him to the Intercontinental Championship in February 1986 at the Boston Garden. In a classic villainous finish, he used a foreign object to knock out Tito Santana, beginning a historic 413-day reign. During this run, his feud with George the Animal Steele blurred the lines of reality. Steele's character was infatuated with Elizabeth, a storyline that tapped directly into Savage's real-life possessiveness. Backstage, Savage was known to forbid Elizabeth from speaking to other wrestlers and checked hallways to ensure they were empty before she walked down them. The Rage fans saw in his eyes when Steele approached Elizabeth wasn't acting. He was protecting his wife. By 1987, Vince McMahon needed a masterpiece to steal the show at WrestleMania 3, which was headlined by Hogan versus Andre. He chose Savage and Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. The build-up was violent, featuring an angle where Savage crushed Steamboat's larynx with a ring bell, but the preparation revealed Savage's obsessive need for control. Unlike the improvisational style of the era, Savage scripted the entire WrestleMania match at his home in Florida. He outlined 169 distinct moves in a notebook and drilled Steamboat until they could perform the sequence blindfolded. He refused to leave anything to chance on the biggest stage of his life. At the Pontiac Silverdome, in front of 93,000 fans, they delivered what is widely considered the greatest match of the 20th century. The pace was blistering, a series of seamless exchanges and near falls that left the audience breathless. Savage lost the match after Steamboat countered a slam into a small package pin, ending his title reign. However, the performance was so undeniable that the fans turned him into a hero. The Macho Man had become too cool to boo. This shift led to the formation of the Mega Powers in late 1987, when Hulk Hogan saved Savage from a beatdown by the Honky Tonk Man. It was a commercial dream team, uniting the two biggest brands in wrestling. Yet for Savage, it was a devil's bargain. By aligning with Hogan, he stepped into the brightest spotlight, but also into the shadow of the industry's top star, a man known for his backstage politics and his eye for women. In 1988 at WrestleMania 4, Savage won a one-night tournament to become the undisputed WWF World Heavyweight Champion, defeating Ted DiBiase in the finals with Hogan's help. It should have been his moment of ultimate triumph. He had gone from a failed baseball player to the king of the world. But the footage of the celebration reveals the tragedy to come. As Savage hoisted the belt and Elizabeth onto his shoulder, his eyes darted frantically between his wife and Hulk Hogan. Even in his greatest moment, the seeds of destruction were planted. He was the champion, but he was already terrified that the man standing next to him was coming for everything he loved. The morning after WrestleMania 4, Randy Savage woke up as the undisputed champion, but the gold belt resting on his nightstand didn't bring peace. Instead, it acted as a magnifying glass, intensifying every paranoia and insecurity lurking in his mind. He had reached the summit only to realize that the only direction left to go was down. The primary architect of this psychological pressure cooker was the very alliance that had propelled him to the title, the Mega Powers. On paper, the union of Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage was a marketing dream, a consolidation of the two most potent forces in the industry. However, the reality was a festering wound for Savage. Despite holding the title that designated him as the #1 man, he found himself perpetually trapped in the colossal shadow of Hulkamania. Hogan was the golden boy, the movie star, and the man who commanded the highest merchandise checks, while Savage was positioned as the fighting champion, the workhorse expected to carry the athletic burden of the main events, while Hogan merely had to show up and cup his ear to the crowd. This disparity gnawed at Savage's immense pride, feeding a resentment that was not entirely scripted. He knew that in the eyes of Vince McMahon, the belt he wore was merely on loan until the day Hogan decided he wanted it back. To make matters infinitely worse, the third pillar of this crumbling temple was Elizabeth. By incorporating her into the Mega Powers as the shared manager of both superstars, the WWF creative team had unwittingly placed Randy Savage's real-life wife into the orbit of a man known for his ruthless backstage politicking. The narrative required Hogan to be physically close to Elizabeth, to lift her onto his shoulders in victory, to hug her, and to whisper strategies into her ear. These actions were innocuous to the millions of children watching at home, but they were torture for a husband who was already legendary for his suffocating possessiveness. Savage's jealousy was not a character trait invented for the screen. It was the defining flaw of his personal life. As the weeks turned into months, the scripted tension between the Mega Powers began to bleed into reality. With Savage watching Hogan's interactions with Elizabeth like a hawk, his mind poisoning itself with scenarios of infidelity that may have existed only in his own fevered imagination. The brilliance and cruelty of this era lay in how Vince McMahon exploited this real-world tension. Throughout late 1988 and early 1989, the television product began to feature subtle moments of friction that allowed Savage to express his genuine frustrations under the guise of performance. The cameras would zoom in on his face, capturing a look that was not merely acting. It was the look of a man realizing he was being edged out of his own life. The narrative hook became lust in the eyes, a storyline suggestion that Hogan secretly coveted Elizabeth. This struck a nerve so deep within Savage that his promos began to lose their coherence, shifting from the usual high-octane bravado into dark, rambling diatribes about loyalty and betrayal that felt uncomfortably intimate. The audience could feel the heat radiating off the screen, not realizing they were watching the disintegration of a real marriage broadcast as entertainment. The explosion finally occurred on the night of February 3rd, 1989, during the main event on NBC. In a scripted moment that would define the rest of Savage's career, Akeem threw Savage over the top rope, causing him to crash into Elizabeth and knock her unconscious. Hogan abandoned the match to carry the injured Elizabeth to the back, leaving Savage alone in the ring to be decimated. When Savage finally crawled back to the locker room, battered and humiliated, he did not find a repentant partner. He found Hogan weeping over Elizabeth, holding her hand in a tableau that looked less like concern and more like romance. The confrontation that followed in the medical room was the single greatest acting performance of Randy Savage's life, primarily because he wasn't acting. He burst into the room not with a scream, but with a terrifying trembling quietness. When he pointed a shaking finger at Hogan and hissed, "You have lust in your eyes," he was exorcising the demons that had been haunting his sleep for a year, delivering a line that shattered the fourth wall and turned the Mega Powers saga into a documentary of a mental breakdown. The road to WrestleMania 5 was paved with this visceral intensity. Savage transformed from the neon-clad hero into a dark, brooding villain who wore black and spoke in riddles, claiming to have been the glue that held the team together while Hogan was merely the hot dog seeking glory. For Randy Poffo, the weeks leading up to the event were an exquisite form of torture, as he was forced to promote a match that was essentially a public dramatization of his failing marriage. Elizabeth was placed in a neutral corner, a creative decision that symbolized her real-life separation from Savage, as the constant pressure of the storyline and Savage's increasing volatility had driven a wedge between them that no amount of love could bridge. When they arrived at Trump Plaza in Atlantic City, the match itself was a brutal, emotional brawl. Savage worked with a viciousness that suggested he wanted to hurt Hogan for real, targeting his eyes and throat. Despite Savage's masterful performance, the outcome was predetermined. Hogan hulked up and pinned Savage to reclaim the WWF Championship. Savage lay flat on his back, staring up at the lights, stripped of his title, his team, and effectively, his wife. In the aftermath of this devastating loss, Randy Savage found himself adrift. In a desperate bid to reinvent himself and fill the void left by the championship, he adopted the persona of the Macho King after winning the King of the Ring tournament. He traded the cowboy hats for a heavy gilded crown and a scepter, demanding that announcers refer to him as Your Highness. To complete the transformation, he hired a new manager, sensational Sherry Martel. Sherry was the antithesis of Elizabeth, loud, aggressive, vulgar, and violent. Together, they were a terrifying duo, creating a wall of noise and chaos that masked the emptiness Savage felt inside. The Macho King was not a fun character. He was a tyrant, a paranoid monarch who lashed out at his subjects because he had lost control of his kingdom. Behind the scenes, the divorce proceedings were quietly moving forward, a tragic counterpoint to the on-screen absurdity. Randy and Elizabeth dissolved their legal union while still having to see each other in arenas across the country, a constant reopening of the wound that drove Savage to work harder, bump harder, and scream louder to drown out the silence of his hotel room. The darkness of the Macho King era culminated in a feud with the Ultimate Warrior, leading to a career-ending match at WrestleMania 7 in 1991. By this point, Randy Savage was physically battered and emotionally exhausted, his body screaming for rest after years of the punishing top rope elbow drops. He approached the match with a sense of finality, seeing the retirement stipulation not as a punishment, but as an escape hatch. The match was an epic encounter, a storytelling masterpiece, where Savage hit 5 consecutive elbow drops only for the Warrior to kick out, a moment that signaled the end of Savage's dominance. When the Warrior finally pinned him, placing one foot on his chest in the ultimate sign of disrespect, Savage lay in the ring, a fallen king, defeated and retired. What happened next remains the most emotional sequence in the history of professional wrestling. As Savage lay defeated, Sherry Martel entered the ring, not to comfort him, but to abuse him, kicking the fallen legend and screaming that he had failed her. Suddenly, from the crowd, Elizabeth, who had been watching from the audience, leaped over the guardrail. She rushed the ring and threw Sherry to the outside, defending the man who had caused her so much pain. When Savage rose to his feet and saw her, he raised his hands in defense, expecting another attack, a heartbreaking reflex that showed how deeply his trust had been eroded. But when he realized she was crying, the Macho King persona melted away, leaving only Randy. The two embraced in the center of the ring, crying real tears as the camera panned to the audience, where grown men and women were openly weeping. It was a scene of redemption, a fairy tale ending where love conquered all. However, the tragedy of Randy Savage is that the fairy tale ended the moment they walked through the curtain. The on-screen reunion was a beautiful lie, a final gift to the fans to write a happy ending for a story that had no happy ending in real life. Backstage, there was no romantic reconciliation. There were only two people who had loved each other deeply, but could no longer live together, proceeding with the cold legality of their divorce. Randy Savage was officially retired, stripped of his wrestling purpose. He had been given a hero send-off, but he was walking into a void. He was a gladiator without an arena, a husband without a wife, and a man who had spent so long being the Macho Man that he no longer knew how to be anyone else. The agonizing paradox of Randy Savage's life in the summer of 1991 was that he was starring in a fairy tale while living in a tragedy, a dissonance that would have shattered a lesser performer but merely drove the Macho Man to retreat deeper into the fortress of his own eccentricities. Following the emotional crescendo of WrestleMania 7, where he and Elizabeth had reunited in a tearful embrace that captivated the World Wrestling Federation embarked on a storyline that was intended to be the ultimate celebration of their love, the match made in heaven. It was to be a televised wedding, a grand, spectacular ceremony held at SummerSlam in Madison Square Garden, complete with white doves, a massive train for the bride, and the adoration of millions. However, behind the curtain, the reality was a stark, heartbreaking contrast to the pageantry, as the legal dissolution of Randy and Elizabeth's real-life marriage was already in motion, the papers being shuffled between lawyers, even as the scriptwriters were drafting their vows. For Randy Poffo, standing at the altar in a blindingly white tuxedo, looking into the eyes of the woman he was losing, and pledging an eternal love that had already expired in the eyes of the law, must have been an exercise in supreme masochism, a public performance of a private funeral where he was required to smile through the grief of his own divorce. The wedding itself was a masterpiece of kayfabe, a moment of pure, unadulterated joy for the fans who had followed the saga for 6 years. But the peace was short-lived, shattered by the arrival of a new, darker darkness in the form of Jake the Snake Roberts. Roberts, a master of psychological horror whose soft-spoken reptilian charisma was the perfect antithesis to Savage's high-volume manic energy, crashed the wedding reception in a storyline that felt violently intrusive. When Roberts and The Undertaker attacked Savage, locking a king cobra in a gift box for Elizabeth to find, it triggered a primal protective instinct in Savage that transcended the scripted nature of the entertainment. The retirement stipulation from WrestleMania 7 was meant to be binding, keeping Savage at the commentary desk or in non-wrestling roles, but the vitriol of the feud with Roberts was too potent to contain, forcing the WWF to launch a reinstatement campaign where fans petitioned to bring the Macho Man back to the ring. This campaign culminated in an incident that remains one of the most shocking and visceral moments in the history of televised wrestling, a moment that blurred the lines of safety and sanity in a way that only Savage could facilitate. On a Saturday morning broadcast attempting to goad Savage into a fight, Jake Roberts lured him into the ring and trapped him in the ropes, leaving him defenseless. In a scene that traumatized a generation of children, Roberts unleashed his King Cobra, a real devenomed but very much alive snake, and allowed it to latch onto Randy Savage's arm. The snake did not just strike, it gnawed, its fangs sinking into the bicep of the Macho Man as blood began to trickle down his arm, while Savage writhed in a performance that was terrifyingly realistic because the pain was genuine. Savage refused to break character, refused to call for help, allowing the animal to chew on his flesh, to sell the angle, a testament to his fanatical commitment to the business. This act of violence broke the seal on his retirement, bringing him roaring back into active competition, not as the flamboyant showman of the 80s, but as an avenging angel, a man driven by a fury that felt dangerous and unhinged. The return to the ring led Savage straight into the path of the nature boy Ric Flair, the NWA legend who had finally arrived in the WWF, claiming to be the real world's champion. The feud between Savage and Flair heading into WrestleMania 8 in 1992 was built on a premise that struck at the very heart of Savage's deepest insecurities, Elizabeth's past. Flair, playing the role of the arrogant playboy, claimed that before Elizabeth met Savage, she had been with him, producing doctored photographs of the two of them together to humiliate Savage publicly. It was a storyline that weaponized Savage's well-known jealousy, taking the real-life whispers about his possessiveness and turning them into a national scandal. Savage's promos during this period were terrifying. He didn't scream so much as he vibrated with rage, his eyes hidden behind wraparound sunglasses, his voice cracking with the strain of a man trying to defend his wife's honor against a ghost that he couldn't punch. When they finally met at the Hoosier Dome in Indianapolis for WrestleMania 8, the match was an explosion of pent-up aggression, a brawl that felt less like a wrestling match and more like a street fight fueled by genuine animosity. Savage, bleeding profusely from his forehead, a blade job that he performed in secret against the strict no-blood policy of the WWF at the time, risking a hefty fine to add realism to the drama, fought with a desperation that resonated with every person in the arena. When he finally pinned Ric Flair to win his second WWF World Heavyweight Championship, the celebration was markedly different from his first victory 4 years earlier. There was no joy, no triumphant hoisting of Elizabeth. There was only relief, the exhaustion of a man who had silenced the doubters, but was still left standing in the ruins of his personal life. He held the belt, but the romance was effectively over. Elizabeth would leave the company shortly after, disappearing from television and leaving Savage to navigate his championship reign alone, a king without a queen, defending a castle that was already empty. The summer of 1992 saw Savage carrying the company on his back once again, engaging in a rivalry with the Ultimate Warrior that culminated in a massive main event at SummerSlam at Wembley Stadium in London. Performing before 80,000 fans, Savage proved that even entering his 40s, he was still the best in-ring storyteller in the business, guiding the erratic Warrior through a match that was dramatic, layered, and psychologically complex. However, the political winds of the WWF were shifting. Vince McMahon was beginning to look toward a younger horizon, a new generation of smaller, faster athletes, and he began to view Savage not as the present, but as a legacy act. Savage eventually dropped the title back to Ric Flair due to interference, a transition that marked the beginning of his slow fade from the main event scene, a demotion that Savage, with his fierce pride and competitive fire, found impossible to accept. By 1993, the writing was on the wall. Vince McMahon wanted Randy Savage out of the ring and behind the microphone. The launch of Monday Night Raw, a revolutionary live weekly program, required a color commentator who could bring energy and star power to the broadcast booth, and McMahon tapped Savage for the role. For a time, Savage excelled, his unique cadence and bizarre observations making him a cult favorite among viewers, while his outlandish outfits, tassel-covered cowboy hats, neon suits that defied the color spectrum, became a staple of the show. Yet, sitting at that desk wearing the headset, Savage was dying a slow death. He watched wrestlers like Shawn Michaels, Razor Ramon, and Bret Hart tearing down the house, and he knew, with the certainty of a man who kept himself in immaculate physical condition, that he could still outwork them all. He would often stand up during matches, twitching, shadowboxing, barely able to contain the energy that was being wasted on sound bites, feeling like a racehorse locked in a stable while the donkeys ran the derby. The tension between Savage and McMahon grew toxic throughout 1994, a silent war of wills between a promoter who believed in the youth movement and a legend who refused to go quietly into the night. Savage pitched ideas for feuds, for matches, for one last run at the top, specifically targeting Shawn Michaels as a potential opponent, a match that would have undoubtedly been a classic. But McMahon rebuffed him at every turn, insisting that Savage's wrestling days were over. This rejection was a profound insult to a man who had sacrificed his body, his marriage, and his sanity for the company. And Savage began to feel that he was being put out to pasture, treated like a relic in a museum, rather than the weapon he knew he still was. The breaking point came when his contract expired in the autumn of 1994, and instead of a negotiation, he was met with a wall of indifference. The WWF was moving on, and there was no seat on the bus for the Macho Man unless he stayed in the announcer's chair. The departure, when it finally happened, was shocking in its abruptness and its finality. There was no farewell tour, no retirement speech, no handshake in the ring. Randy Savage simply vanished from WWF television. One week he was there, and the next, Jerry Lawler was sitting in his chair. In a move that was perceived as the ultimate betrayal by McMahon, Savage secretly negotiated with World Championship Wrestling, the rival promotion based in Atlanta that was backed by the deep pockets of Ted Turner and was actively recruiting the stars of the 80s to wage war on the WWF. Savage didn't just leave. He defected, jumping enemy lines without a backward glance, driven by a burning need to prove that Vince McMahon was wrong, that the Macho Man was not a nostalgia act, and that he still had plenty of madness left in the tank. When Randy Savage appeared on WCW Saturday Night in December 1994, the wrestling world tilted on its axis. He looked reinvigorated, practically vibrating with the thrill of a new challenge, and he immediately inserted himself into the main event picture, reuniting with and confronting his old nemesis and partner, Hulk Hogan. But this jump was not just a business decision, it was a personal declaration of independence. Savage was bringing his brand, his voice, and his Slim Jim sponsorship to the competition, effectively firing the first major shot in what would become the Monday Night Wars. However, he was also walking into a chaotic, disorganized environment where the inmates ran the asylum, a place where the politics were even deadlier than in New York. As he stepped through the curtain in WCW, Randy Savage believed he was escaping the cage of retirement, but he did not yet realize that he was entering a new kind of wilderness, one where his legacy would be challenged, his body would be pushed to the breaking point, and the ghosts of his past, specifically the ghost of Miss Elizabeth, would be waiting for him in the shadows of the Omni. When he walked down the aisle on WCW television, the fringe on his jacket shaking with his trademark kinetic energy, there was a frightening intensity in his eyes that went beyond the character. He wasn't just performing for the fans in the Omni Coliseum. He was performing for an audience of one, staring down the camera lens to show the promoter in Connecticut exactly what he had thrown away. This chip on his shoulder turned him into a man possessed, and for the first 2 years of his tenure in Atlanta, Savage wrestled with a reckless abandon that belied his 42 years, throwing his body into steel guardrails and taking bumps on concrete floors as if he were trying to break himself just to prove he couldn't be broken. However, the sanctuary he sought in WCW turned out to be a hall of mirrors, a chaotic and politically treacherous environment where the inmates ran the asylum and the ghosts of his past were waiting to ambush him. The most formidable of these ghosts was, inevitably, Hulk Hogan. Savage had defected to WCW to escape Hogan's shadow, only to find himself thrust immediately back into it, forced once again to play the role of the volatile lieutenant to Hogan's golden general in a rehash of the Mega Powers dynamic that felt like a cruel cosmic joke. While Hogan wielded unprecedented creative control, manipulating storylines to ensure he remained the focal point of the promotion, Savage was often left to fight for scraps of the spotlight, his resentment simmering beneath the surface of their on-screen alliance. This professional frustration was compounded by the surreal and painful return of Miss Elizabeth to the wrestling world, brought into WCW as a surprise to boost ratings. The woman who was now his ex-wife, the woman he had divorced in a storm of heartbreak and lawyers, was once again his co-worker. The cruelty of the wrestling business is that it strip mines real human emotion for entertainment, and the WCW writers, lacking any sense of boundary or decency, threw Randy and Elizabeth into storylines that picked at the scabs of their failed marriage. In 1996, during the Super Brawl 6 pay-per-view, the script called for Elizabeth to turn on Savage, handing her high-heeled shoe to Ric Flair so he could knock Savage unconscious. For Randy Poffo, the man, to lie on the canvas and listen to the crowd cheer as his real-life ex-wife betrayed him in fiction must have been a dissociative nightmare, a blurring of reality where the pain of the past was reenacted for profit. He was professional, he did the job, but those close to him noted a darkening of his spirit during this period, a retreat into a shell of paranoia where he trusted no one, ate alone, traveled alone, and spoke to almost no one in the locker room, convinced that the entire world was conspiring to humiliate him. This isolation deepened with the advent of the New World Order in 1996, a storyline shift that revolutionized the industry but left Savage in a precarious position. When Hogan turned villain to lead the NWO, the industry became cool again, shifting from the cartoonish morality of the 80s to a gritty shades of gray realism. And Savage, ever the chameleon, knew he had to evolve or die. After a brief period as the defender of WCW, a role where he was essentially a martyr, constantly beaten down by the NWO numbers game, Savage shocked the world by joining the faction himself, trading his neon yellows and pinks for the stark black and white of the Rebels. This transition marked the death of the Macho Man, of the golden era. Gone were the pomp and circumstance, the regal robes, and the noble intentions, replaced by a darker, grimmier character who wore bandanas, vandalized property, and spoke with a venomous nihilism. Yet even in the NWO, Savage found himself trapped in the same hierarchy. Hogan was the leader, the mouthpiece, the star, while Savage was the workhorse, the man who added legitimacy to the group's matches, but was rarely given the credit for their success. The backstage politics of WCW were a shark tank, and Savage, who despised the schmoozing and the good old boy network, navigated it by becoming increasingly erratic and difficult to work with, a defense mechanism designed to keep people at bay. He became famous for his obsessive preparation in a company known for its laziness, showing up hours early, locking himself in a room, and planning his matches down to the microsecond, screaming at opponents who dared to deviate from his script. This control freak tendency was not arrogance, it was fear. Fear that if he let go of the reins for even a second, the chaos of WCW would swallow him whole, or worse, that someone would take liberties with his body in the ring, and the body was failing. This is the silent physical tragedy that underpinned the late 90s for Randy Savage. He was a man at war with his own biology. Decades of dropping the flying elbow, a move where he landed with his full weight on his right hip, compressing his spine and grinding his joints into dust, had left him in chronic, agonizing pain. His knees were shot, his back was a mess of inflammation and scar tissue, and his shoulders were held together by tape and willpower. To compensate for the loss of speed and agility, and perhaps to mask the frailty he felt inside, Savage turned to hypertrophy. He hit the gym with a manic, almost dysmorphic intensity, transforming his physique from the lean, athletic build of 1988 into a massive hulking wall of muscle. By 1998, he was physically larger than he had ever been, his veins popping against his skin like road maps, a transformation that whispered of chemical assistance and a desperate need to armor himself against a younger, faster generation of wrestlers like Rey Mysterio and Chris Jericho, who were nipping at his heels. The defining moment of this physical decline occurred in 1998 during a match against Hogan, where Savage attempted a simple jump and his knee simply exploded. His ACL tore completely, a catastrophic injury that should have ended the match immediately. Instead, in a display of toughness that bordered on psychosis, Savage finished the match, wrestling on a destabilized joint, screaming through the pain, refusing to show weakness in front of the man he viewed as his arch-rival. The subsequent surgery and rehabilitation forced him to the sidelines. A period of enforced silence where he sat in his Florida home, watching the show go on without him, watching the young stars rise, and feeling the cold breath of obsolescence on his neck. When he returned in 1999, Randy Savage was unrecognizable, unveiling a final, bizarre reinvention that felt like a midlife crisis broadcast on national television. He had slicked back his hair into a ponytail, grown a heavy salt and pepper beard, and traded his wrestling tights for leather pants and streetwear. He surrounded himself with a harem of women, Team Madness, which included Medusa, Mona, and his new real-life girlfriend, Stephanie Bellars, whom he christened Gorgeous George. This version of Savage was slower, stiffer, and relied more on brawling than athleticism, but psychologically, it was fascinating. He was trying to be cool for the Attitude Era, trying to fit into the MTV aesthetic of the late 90s. He won the WCW World title again during this period, but the reigns were short, confused, and marred by the collapsing creative structure of the company. Behind the sunglasses, the eyes were tired. The spark of the Macho Man was dimming, replaced by the weary glare of a veteran who was just trying to get through the night. The controversy of his final years in WCW was not just about his character, but about his increasing detachment from the industry itself. As WCW began its rapid, fiery descent into bankruptcy in 2000, Savage saw the writing on the wall before anyone else. He saw the incompetence of the management, the toxicity of the locker room, and the futility of trying to save a sinking ship. He began to withdraw, refusing to participate in the humiliating storylines that characterized the dying days of the promotion, protecting his legacy by simply not showing up. He became a ghost in the machine, collecting his paycheck but offering nothing of his soul. A sad ending for a man who had once given every ounce of his blood to the canvas. When WCW was finally purchased by his nemesis Vince McMahon in March 2001, effectively ending the Monday Night Wars, Randy Savage was nowhere to be found. He did not appear on the final broadcast. He did not give interviews. He simply vanished into the Florida humidity. Following the collapse of WCW in 2001, Savage entered a peculiar kind of purgatory. While he remained a pop culture icon, he became a ghost in the industry that made him a god. The WWE established a monopoly, and for reasons still debated seemingly decreed that the name Randy Savage was to be struck from the record books. Yet rather than begging for forgiveness, Savage chose dignified defiance. In 2002, he stepped onto a different stage, appearing in Sam Raimi's blockbuster Spider-Man as Bonesaw McGraw, proving his magnetism existed independently of Vince McMahon's machine. In 2003, Savage made a foray into music that was widely mocked by critics, but was deeply revealing of his mental state. He released a rap album titled Be a Man. While the production was dated and the flow was questionable, the lyrics were a raw, unfiltered window into his soul. The title track was a scathing, 4-minute diss track aimed directly at Hulk Hogan, challenging him to a legitimate fight and accusing him of being a coward and a manipulator. To the casual listener, it was a celebrity novelty act. To those who knew the history, it was the sound of a man who was still carrying the baggage of 1989, a man who could not let go of the betrayal he felt at the hands of the megapowers. It was proof that the Macho Man persona was still protecting the wounded heart of Randy Poffo, lashing out at the ghosts of the past because he hadn't yet found a way to make peace with the present. The final flickering embers of his in-ring career burned out in late 2004 and early 2005 when he made a brief, ill-fated return to the ring with Total Nonstop Action Wrestling, a startup promotion attempting to challenge the WWE monopoly. His arrival at the Victory Road pay-per-view was a moment of shock. He emerged from the darkness, dressed entirely in black, looking heavier, older, but still possessing that undeniable aura of danger. However, the reality of the squared circle is unforgiving, and it quickly became apparent that the Macho Man of 1987 was gone forever. His body, ravaged by 30 years of high-impact crashes, could no longer perform the miracles his mind could conceive. His movements were stiff, his famous speed was gone, and he was protected in 6-man tag matches to hide his limitations. Backstage, the old frictions resurfaced. Savage, ever the perfectionist, clashed with the TNA management over creative direction and the outcome of matches. His desire to protect his character colliding with the reality that he was no longer the future of the business. He left TNA abruptly in early 2005 due to health concerns and disagreements, disappearing as quickly as he had arrived. It was an unceremonious end to a legendary career, a quiet exit through the back door rather than a blaze of glory. But it was a necessary one. It was the moment Randy Savage finally accepted that the war was over. But as the wrestling door closed, another door, one that had been shut since 1971, creaked open. In the quiet aftermath of his retirement, stripped of the tights, the steroids, and the screaming fans, Randy Poffo found himself reconnecting with the person he was before the madness began. He reconnected with Lynn Payne. Lynn was not a ring rat, a model, or a fan. She was his high school sweetheart, a woman who had known him when he was just a baseball-obsessed kid from Downers Grove with a good throwing arm and a shy smile. They had dated as teenagers, drifted apart as lives often do, and gone their separate ways for decades. But fate, in its kinder moments, brought them back together in the autumn of their lives. For Randy, Lynn was a revelation. She didn't care about the World Heavyweight Championship. She didn't care about the feud with Ric Flair. She didn't care about the Slim Jim royalties. She saw the man beneath the scar tissue. She saw Randy. The relationship that blossomed between them was the antidote to the toxicity of his first marriage. Where his relationship with Elizabeth had been defined by jealousy, public scrutiny, and the blurring of fiction and reality, his relationship with Lynn was defined by privacy, stability, and genuine companionship. She was his anchor. Slowly, the armor of the Macho Man began to fall away, The transformation was physical as well as psychological. He cut off the long, frizzy hair that had been his trademark for 3 decades, revealing a face that looked distinguished and kind. He let his beard go gray, embracing his age rather than fighting it with dye. He stopped wearing the kaleidoscope outfits and started wearing jeans and t-shirts. He began to live a life that was shockingly, beautifully normal. Neighbors in his Seminole, Florida community began to see a side of him that the world never knew. They saw him pushing a shopping cart at the local grocery store, pausing to meticulously check the expiration dates on milk cartons. They saw him riding his bicycle along the beach, not as a training exercise for a cage match, but simply to feel the wind on his face. They saw him attending school events for his nieces and nephews, sitting quietly in the bleachers, cheering not with a primal scream, but with a proud uncle's applause. He was approachable, gracious, and surprisingly soft-spoken. When fans did recognize him, which was harder to do without the hat and glasses, he didn't launch into a promo. He shook their hand, asked them their name, and thanked them for remembering him. He was discovering the joy of being human. This period of peace was solidified by a profound loss. On March 4th, 2010, the patriarch of the Poffo dynasty, Angelo Poffo, passed away at the age of 84. For Randy, Angelo had been more than a father. He had been his trainer, his promoter, his critic, and his compass. The death of the man who had pushed him into the ring, who had demanded perfection, and who had taught him the value of $1, marked the final severance from his past life. Standing at his father's grave, Randy Poffo was no longer the soldier following orders. He was the head of the family. The grief was immense, but it brought with it a clarity about his own mortality. He realized that time was the one opponent he couldn't beat, and he decided not to waste a single second of what remained. Less than a year after his father's death, Randy Savage made the ultimate commitment to his new life. On May 10th, 2010, on a pristine stretch of Lido Beach in Sarasota, Florida, Randy Poffo married Lynn Payne. There were no pay-per-view cameras, no pyrotechnics, no screaming announcers, and no wrestling angles. It was a small, intimate ceremony attended by family and close friends. Photos from that day show a man who looks unrecognizable from the Macho King of 1991. He is wearing a simple suit. The ocean breeze is blowing through his short gray hair, and he is looking at Lynn with an expression of pure, unadulterated serenity. It was the match made in heaven that actually was made in heaven, not in a boardroom. In the year that followed the wedding, Randy Savage was the happiest he had ever been. He spoke to his brother Lanny often, speaking of a contentment that had eluded him during his years of fame. He was making plans for the future, plans to travel, to work with charities, to perhaps finally write a book and tell his side of the story. He was a man who had survived the carnival. He had walked through the fire of the 1980s, survived the steroid culture, survived the divorces, survived the concussions, and he had come out the other side. He had won. But the tragedy of the Greek hero is that fate is often jealous of peace. Just as Odysseus finally returns home after his long, brutal voyage, the fates were preparing to cut the thread. The bill for the madness was about to come due. On the morning of May 20th, 2011, under the bright sun of Seminole, Florida, the silence was broken. Randy Savage, now 58 years old, suffered a massive heart attack whilst driving his Jeep Wrangler. He slumped over the wheel, and the vehicle drifted across the median, colliding with an oak tree. The autopsy revealed the devastating truth. His heart was enlarged, and his arteries were over 90% blocked. The engine that had powered the most intense performer in history had been destroyed by the stress, the lifestyle, and the sheer physical demand of being the Macho Man. The ultimate tragedy is not that he died, but when he died. He passed away at the precise moment he had finally escaped the toxicity of the wrestling business. He had found love, he had found anonymity, and he had found peace with the man in the mirror. Randy Savage gave his life to become a legend, but in the end, the price of the madness was his own heart.